Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. My name's Mark. I'm the Diabetes Diet Guy and also run Mark Green Nutrition, which is my services page. And today I'm here to talk to you about how you can prevent variable blood glucose levels if you suffer with type 1 diabetes or follow a basal bolus regimen. This is something that comes up quite a lot in my practice where I encounter a patient, usually a type 1 in fairness, where they're having problems keeping their blood glucose levels steady, and instead they tend to see these swings where they go up and down throughout the day. Usually they're taking way more insulin than they need to take, which can have issues with them putting on weight. And it's something that, can affect both physical and mental health because it's something that preoccupies them all day, every day. And really just getting a more level blood glucose level would really help them out. And so there's some simple principles that you can follow that I'm going to talk to you today about in terms of how you can level out those glucose levels with some simple strategies that you can put in place today. So the principle I'm talking about is carbohydrate counting or some variations of it. Now you may be familiar with this and you may have tried it in the past and not got on with it too well, but hear me out because there are still some principles that you may take from this. Even if it's not strict carbohydrate counting itself, there's definitely ways in which you can manage this in a more efficient way and it still might eradicate some of those swings that you see in your glucose levels. So let's just take to the pen and paper because I'm going to show you by drawing it out how you can manage this. Okay, so when it comes to carbohydrate counting and eradicating these variable glucose levels, the first thing you need to do is to be able to identify the foods that will affect your blood glucose levels. And this is really one particular type of food group where we get energy from. And we get energy from 4 types of food. We have carbohydrates, fat, protein, and also alcohol. Now, the food that we're primarily concerned with in terms of blood glucose levels is carbohydrates. And you have 2 subcategories of carbohydrates. So carbohydrate is really an umbrella term that describes several different types of food groups. On one side of the spectrum, you have starchy carbohydrates, and this is like your bread, pasta, rice, cereal, oats, any flour-based products, pastry, breadcrumbs, and all of these foods are actually converted into glucose or sugar when we eat them, so they push up blood glucose levels. On the other end, or on the other side, we have sugar. Now, you have 2 other subcategories that come off sugar, which are natural sugars, which is like fruit and milk sugars. You may have heard of lactose. O's, anything that ends in OSE means sugar. So milk sugars are sugar and they are natural sugars. And also you have vegetables, but for the purposes of carbohydrate counting, in most circumstances, the carbohydrate content is so low that we don't really consider it, or you will literally drive yourself crazy trying to add up all the vegetables. It might be the difference of an extra unit or 2 of insulin, but you can kind of figure that out as you're going without having to go into intensive carbohydrate counting for such a thing. And you also have your processed sugars. And this is things like cakes, biscuits, sweets, chocolate, actual sugar, so sucrose, OSE again. Also fruit juices, honey, syrups. Although you might normally associate those with natural sugars, the way they're put together and by the time they've reached the shelf, and more importantly, the way they behave in the body, makes them act more like processed sugars. And these tend to spike blood glucose levels quite high, and a lot of these things we can use for hypo treatments because they're quite quick acting. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So under the carbohydrate banner, you have starch, you have sugar, of which you have 2 subcategories, natural and processed. All of these are carbohydrates, all of these are converted into glucose when we eat them, and so all of these will push up your blood glucose levels. Protein foods, for the purposes of this, we say do not affect blood glucose levels, so that's like your meat, fish, nuts, eggs, other things like beans, pulses, lentils. We do classify these as protein foods because that's their predominant nutrient. And so although they have some carbohydrate, you'd have to eat a very significant amount, i.e. a whole tin of chickpeas before they make a big dent in the blood glucose levels. But everyone's an individual. You might find, again, it's just a unit or 2 difference. And also fatty foods, which like oils, spreads, or different types of milk, depending on the fat content. That really has no effect on blood glucose levels in itself, but what it can do is slow absorption of the carbohydrate-containing foods. So if you're having a high-fat meal, you might find that actually there's a delay in the absorption. So if you're taking your insulin before the meal, your blood glucose levels drop low at first and then spike high later because the insulin's got into your system before the fat. So in those circumstances, you could split your dose potentially between the beginning and the end of the meal or during the meal to account for that delayed absorption. So now you know what types of food affect your blood glucose levels. The next thing to do is think about the carbohydrate labeling, or how you identify how much carbohydrate you're eating, because this is the figures that you'll be using to work out how much insulin you need to give. And you can do this in several ways. The most accurate is weighing the food, which isn't as tense as it sounds, because usually it's only one type of food that you're weighing, and it really doesn't take that long, but I do appreciate it's easy for me to sit here and say it. I'm not the one that has to do it. And what you do is you just look at a food label, all right? And it'll always give you this information on the food labels where it tells you protein, fat, carbohydrate, of which sugars, salt, and it might give you some more information as well. The information that we're interested in is carbohydrate, not just of which sugars, total carbohydrate. It's the total carbs we're concerned with, because this is what will affect your blood sugars, whether it's starchy or sugar or any variety of sugar. It's the total carbohydrate. So once you have that information, it'll always tell you it. I'm just going to write this down. Per, and excuse my handwriting, 100 grams. You'll always see that on a food label. For foods that don't have food labels, you can usually go on their websites or their apps, and they will give you the breakdown there. And there's some other methods that I will tell you about as well. But this per 100 grams should be on pretty much all pre-packed food. All right, and we're looking for carbohydrate. So per 100 gram carbohydrate. So let's say, for example, you have something like rice, which might be around 67 grams per 100. Yep. So then you're very unlikely going to eat 100 grams bang on. So let's say in this example, you're having, 75 grams of rice eaten. Now you know the value per 100 gram, but what you don't know is how much carbohydrate is in 75 grams. But it's quite simple, because we have these two values, so you can take per 100 grams 67, and you can times it by your weighed amount. Weighed amount, and then you just divide it by 100. And that will give you the carbohydrate in that portion of rice. So another way of saying it is carbohydrate times weighed amount divided by 100. And that'll tell you how much carbs you're eating. So let's actually just punch that through quickly. I'll get the calculator. So you have 67 grams. Some of you might have already done this in your head. Times 75 divided by 100. 50 grams in this instance. 50 grams of carbs. Okay. So now we know the carbs. So what do we do with that? We usually work how much insulin to give based on ratios. So we'll say X amount of rapid-acting insulin, whatever you're taking, to X amount of grams of carbs. So what we usually start people off on, if we don't have any other information, is 1 unit of rapid-acting insulin for every 10 grams of carbohydrate. 1 unit of rapid-acting insulin for every 10 grams of carbohydrate. Now we know that we have 50 grams in this meal. So how much do you think we're going to give rapid-acting insulin to cover this plate of rice? So you can literally tally it up. 10 equals 1 unit, 20 equals 2 units, and so forth and so forth. So in this example, you will have 5 units rapid acting insulin. All right. The only problem is this assumes that your blood glucose levels are in target when you're having the meal. So what happens if you wake up and you're out of target? Because it'll only bring you back to where you started if you get it right. So let's assume my target is between 5 and 10. I always encourage a fair range because it allows for margins of errors, and blood sugars don't just sit between 6 and 8. They don't. They'll vary. So you target 6 between 5 and 10. All right? Now you've woke up, you test. Blood glucose levels are 14. You're going to have 50 grams of carbohydrate. So you know you're going to give yourself 5 units on your 1 to 10 ratio. But you want to get back between 5 and 10. And we always correct to the midpoint. All right, so we call this a correction dose. So this is extra insulin that you're going to add on top of your meal to bring your blood glucose levels back to where you want them. And we use a ratio for this as well, where we say X amount of extra insulin, rapid acting, reduces blood glucose levels by X. And a generic ratio that we use is 1 unit of additional rapid acting insulin reduces blood glucose levels by 3. Now we're at 14, your target is 5 to 10. So we always try and correct back to the midpoint. So we'll say somewhere between 6 and 8. And you can use easy math. So let's say we want to get back to 8, all right? Blood glucose levels of 14. You're already giving yourself 5 units based on the 50 grams that you've worked out for your meal. So again, you can count this back. We know 1 unit of additional rapid acting insulin will reduce by 3. So you can count it back. 1 extra unit takes 14 to 11, and another additional unit takes it to 8. So we're back within this range. So how many was that? 1, 2. So now you have this 5 for the food plus 2 equals 7 units of rapid acting insulin for that meal. Right? So hopefully you're with me so far. So you've got 7 units of rapid acting insulin. So how does this work out day to day? So we do this just to demonstrate. Blood glucose levels are here. And then you have breakfast, lunch, dinner, bed, and you may also have some snacks, but we'll come to that in a minute. Now, let's have a look at how your insulins work first and foremost. So you have your background insulin, which keeps you safe, drips into your system like this. Okay. Then at meals, your blood glucose levels are going to spike like that. So the idea is that we try and match these spikes with your rapid acting insulin. So it keeps blood glucose levels in check, because if you don't match it, they can spike quite high and above and beyond what you like to see them. Now, the idea is, putting this into practice, is you test before meals and before bed. So upon waking, you've woke up, we know you're going to have 50 grams of carbohydrate in our example. Blood glucose levels were 14. You want them to be between 5 and 10. So you're going to take 5 units for the meal, and you're going to put an additional 2 units in to correct. Now, let's just assume you're not having these snacks for a minute. What you see quite commonly is people testing too frequently between meals, and then they'll add additional corrections in between, which leads to variable blood glucose levels up and down, because you're just correcting and treating hypos or eating all the time to try and chase the insulin. So what we tend to advise is, regardless of what happens here, unless you go hypo or feel unwell, try and resist the urge to correct or add any additional insulin anyway, unless you're snacking, until lunch. So whatever happens when you test here, you just get feedback from what's happened at breakfast. So if you've got it right, fantastic. If they've gone high, then you know next time that you may need to adjust your ratio, especially if it's a consistent pattern, either your carb counting ratio or your correction dose. And we'd encourage you to only change one at a time so we can attribute what the problem was to one of the things. Or if they've gone too low, same principle. And then you repeat that. So again, whatever happens at lunch, you work out your carbs, you work out any corrections, and then you go to dinner and see how that's worked out. And what that does is prevent you from having these swinging blood glucose levels. If they're going to go up, they go up, and they'll be quite steady. If they go down, they go down. Ideally, we don't want them going down too much, but again, at least it prevents this variability. Now, I said about snacks that you might eat in between. Perhaps you're a snacker. This makes it a bit more difficult, I'm not going to lie. But again, what we would do is just say, try to only add the insulin that you need for that snack if you're carb counting. And usually we would say, don't try and have any rapid acting insulin if the snack is below 20 grams of carbs, because 20 grams as a rule is picked up by your background insulin. So it shouldn't spike your blood glucose levels too much. There's just not enough carbohydrate there. You might find you need a unit or two perhaps. Everyone's different. But to start with, try and resist the urge to give rapid-acting insulin for small snacks. If you're having a significant amount of carbs as a snack, then perhaps, put in a little bit of rapid-acting insulin just to cover it. But crucially, do not correct. Because if you start correcting here, you'll still have rapid-acting insulin in your system, and therefore you're going to get this variability again where your blood glucose levels start to do this again, which is what we want to avoid. So add the rapid-acting insulin if you need to for the snack, but try not to correct. Only correct at these meals to start with. And as you get to know your blood glucose levels, you'll see how your patterns start to develop, and ultimately you'll become an expert in your own glucose levels. And your healthcare professionals can be there to facilitate and advise you on how to do this. But ultimately, it's you that will see the day-to-day numbers and how it behaves in reality. And I think that's about it, to be honest, guys. So hopefully that's been useful. There are some great online resources. Bournemouth Hospital have a great online tool called Bertie Online, which teaches you the full Type 1 education training. And it's a great course, quite comprehensive, and it discusses these principles as well. But if you're seeing a lot of variability in your glucose levels, I'd encourage you to go see your diabetes specialist team or get a referral from your GP. And they can just sort of reiterate these principles alongside your diabetes specialist nurses and your diabetes specialist dietitians. But hopefully we can just eradicate with these simple principles, if you're seeing this, these variable blood glucose levels, and instead get more of a pattern that resembles normal blood glucose levels, which would be along the lines of up they go, up they go, up they go at meals. As you can see, that's a bit more steady. And they will go up on their own naturally, so don't feel like a difference between a 5 and a 10 is erratic. It's not. But what we want to do, as I say, is eradicate this, where you're dropping below the line and hypoing, because that will end up being quite unproductive in terms of your diabetes care, and you'll probably be quite frustrating. Now, if you need help, remember to check out my service page, Mark Green Nutrition, where I do one-to-one consultancy, or check out the blog for more information, diabetesdietguy.com, where I have free information all on there, and also have my consultancy services. So hopefully you enjoy the blog, guys, and I'll see you later.